Library Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Litchfield, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respect to the elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions, culture and acknowledgement of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries we will never cede. And I'd like to introduce Brian Rieusset, our very first speaker, and understanding VDL. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, and thanks for coming along to my talk. Volume, yes. Was the volume on it? And also, you've got a control on it?
No, it should be.
Technology, but maybe a little bit more volume on the clip it if you can. So 1, 2, 3. Is that better? Can you hear me down the back? No, there's still more volume. Maybe if I move the microphone closer. How about that? That's much better. All right. Well, incarceration, as you can see on the screen there, it literally means the state of being confined, imprisoned, interred, confined, detained, or in detention, custody, and restraint. But the talk today, I hope, will improve your understanding and knowledge regarding many aspects of the various establishments in Tasmania, the physical location, construction, the operations of incarceration, used both in Van Diemen's Land, early days, and later in Tasmania and up till the 20th century, for both males and females. I'll try to cover and explain some of the documentation used at the time and how possibly to decipher some of these records to assist you with your family history research. Now, many visitors to Tasmania have at the top of their list a visit to Port Arthur, of course, believing that every convict who was transported to our island ended up at Port Arthur, which we know, of course, only roughly some 12% of male convicts were confined there. They were those who reoffended, committed serious local crimes. When they were sentenced, they were removed to Port Arthur for their term of imprisonment. However, convicts, prisoners, local offenders and even free children spent their time incarcerated in a wide variety of establishments spread throughout the island. I'm not sure whether you can read all that, but there were, of course, the prisoners' barracks, houses of correction, female factories, hulks, hiring depots, mobile road stations, probation stations, and so on. And jails existed in virtually every small-sized town in Tasmania here. But there is so much to cover. I'd like to begin by examining some of the aforementioned establishments, where they were, how they operated, and who was held there. Also, if you were trying to decipher and understand details on your ancestors' convict or prison records, which quite often are completely confusing because they contain abbreviations and virtual shorthand notes, today's talk may be of some benefit with that. And yes, these vagaries in use by the various administrations in note-taking and recording continued on way past the convict transportation period. They were used by many government departments, including the courts, jails, hospitals and institutions, even into the 20th century. The first arrivals, Lieutenant Bowen, apart from the Indigenous people who were there, of course, Lieutenant Bowen arrived with settlers and convicts late in 1803 at Rieusset Cove, naming it Hobart. Months later, David Collins, on his arrival, decided to settle at Sullivan's Cove, and he called it Hobart Town, so there was a distinction. In the north of the island, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson established his settlement at Yorktown in December 1804. The early convicts themselves, though, were relatively free, albeit they worked for the few free settlers and helped establish the new settlements under the control of the military who were there in charge. Naturally, some small buildings were set aside to restrain the convicts when necessary, otherwise they lived originally in tents or in simple huts. It was not till 1813 that a large brick building was constructed here on the corner of Argyle and Melville Street as a secure penitentiary in which to hold the convict men. It's now the site of the Hobart Fire Station, of course, opposite McDonald's. Everyone knows where McDonald's is, and the Spice Station. 2 years later, in 1815, a two-storey house was commandeered as a jail in Murray Street between Macquarie and Davey Streets. A low stone wall was built around the perimeter for security, and later the adjoining small customs storage building next to it on the corner of Macquarie Street was used as a barracks and a jail for female convicts, right up until 1828, when the women were moved to South Hobart to what is now commonly called the Cascades Female Factory. I'll come back to that. The Murray Street Jail, as a modified two-storey house, was always overcrowded. It had minimal facilities. It quite often housed dozens of men and occasionally a few women who'd been arrested and were awaiting trial at the court directly across the road. Murray Street Jail was also the venue for executions from the 1820s until 1857. Meanwhile, in Campbell Street, construction began in 1821 on stone and brick buildings for officials and a large house of correction for male convicts to replace the overcrowded original penitentiary in Argyle Street. Shown on the right here, the House of Correction had its name abbreviated to HC, and when it was still in operation right through to 1963, it was still called HC. The solitary confinement punishment cell block was added to the south of it, called the stone cells because of the thick, solid sandstone floors, walls and roof. It was totally dark inside. It was called N Division, which at the time stood for naughty persons. It's one of those terms that continued all the way through. Still in use today, funnily enough. Another term soon in common use for the whole Campbell Street establishment was the New Penitentiary, or Prisoners' Barracks. And you'll regularly find its abbreviation in convict records, such as PB, Prisoners' Barracks. The convicts themselves referred to it as the Tench, shortened from penitentiary. Again these days, visitors, when hearing the term penitentiary, immediately think of Port Arthur, because they know the penitentiary there, and of course the one in Campbell Street is long gone. To cater for the religious needs of the prisoners and to save them being marched to the overcrowded churches in the city, newly arrived colonial architect and engineer John Lee Archer designed a beautiful penitentiary chapel on the Brisbane Street end of the complex, which fortunately does still exist today. This T-shaped building contained sloping floors similar to modern lecture theatres, which enabled over 1,000 convicts seated on wooden benches to attend services twice a week. Under those sloping floors, John Lee Archer designed 36 solitary confinement cells, which varied in height from roughly 3 feet up until 8 foot tall. There were high-walled exercise yards surrounding the chapel, as you can see there, on this side at least anyway. It meant that the people in solitary confinement got 1 hour's exercise a day. But later on, local free settlers who lived in the area were allowed to use the chapel, which eventually involved adding the beautiful 1834 tower with the clock up there, which still exists today, of course. They gained access to the back of their section of the main body of the church there with a spiral staircase, which was inside the tower. In 1828, a punishment treadwheel was constructed in the building adjoining the House of Correction. Usually 26 men would ascend the steps on an 8-foot diameter wheel, causing it to slowly turn. After 3 revolutions of the wheel, a bell would ring, those men would step down, and they were quickly replaced by another group of men. The wheel was connected to an adjoining flour mill, which could grind up to a tonne of wheat a day. More buildings were soon added, including these 2 beautiful octagonal gate towers, a bakehouse and a kitchen, workshop, and a 2-storey house for the barrack superintendent. In 1840, a penitentiary containing 100 cells was constructed. It was called H Division, for hardened inmates who were separated from the rest of the convicts in the House of Correction, who had slept in dormitories or did sleep in dormitories. After 1853 and the end of transportation, the complex was still in use under the convict system, but by 1857 it was transferred to the Sheriff's Department and became the Hobart Jail, with the removal of prisoners from the Murray Street buildings which Murray Street buildings were quickly sold and demolished, and then new buildings, including the bank, were built on the site. The Campbell Street Jail remained intact and virtually unchanged from its convict prisoners' barracks days until 1963, when most of it was demolished, unfortunately. They made a car park there for government officials, of course. But in that H Division area there, it had certain things which you can see on the screen there. It housed both men and women prisoners from 1877 who continually suffered the indignity of small unheated cells with no running water and only metal buckets with lids called necessary tubs for their toilets, which were removed each morning to be emptied and cleaned in the exercise yards. Male prisoners were removed to Rieusset prison in late 1960, whilst the remaining female inmates had to wait for 18 months before the women's prison was completed at Rieusset. We must return back to the early days. Sarah Island, 1822, with the government greatly in need of a secure penal establishment to house the worst local offenders and those convicts who escaped from other settlements, came up with the idea of using Sarah Island in Macquarie Harbour, on the desolate west coast, of course. It was chosen as a perfect place for banishment. It was ideally suited, being a small island surrounded by treacherous seas in a big harbour, mountainous wilderness, and more than 100 miles from any other settled area. As I said, the access was only by sea through the narrow channel known as Hell's Gates. Although mainly designed for male convicts who were employed in cutting the plentiful supply of beautiful hue and pine timber, and later shipbuilding, of course, on the island itself, there were a few female convicts held there, even some living with their husbands, and certainly children were born on the island, which is not really well talked about. Living conditions in the harsh environment were particularly difficult, with a very limited ability to produce their own food. Medical ailments and diseases such as malnutrition, dysentery, scurvy and bronchial infections were prevalent. Severe punishment included being flogged and often sent to an extreme solitary confinement building on a small adjoining Grummet Island. Escape attempts were numerous, but because of the isolation, few were successful. Many convicts who absconded were never heard from again and were believed to have perished in the bush. 2 did actually survive, living by cannibalising their mates. They were eventually caught and executed, of course. Let's move on. The arrival in Georgetown of Colonel George Arthur in 1824 saw the beginning of many changes which were to take place in the administration of the colony. Although he was reportedly impressed by the isolation and the rugged Sarah Island establishment in Macquarie Harbour, Arthur was looking to establish a second convict settlement closer by sea to Hobart. Maria Island had long been suggested due to its close proximity, but it was a relatively isolated island on the sheltered east coast. The first small contingency of 50 convicts arrived on the island in February 1825 under the command of Peter Murdoch and several superintendents and overseers. Murdoch, who was living in a tent by himself, battered the elements, and he reported back that the convicts he had there were as miserable looking set of vagabonds that I've ever seen. But they quickly built huts, and the men were actually set out to fish to sustain their diet, because otherwise food had to be brought in all the time. Murdoch didn't remain long and was quickly replaced as commandant by Major Thomas Daunt Lord. Lord immediately began cultivating the land. He requested bullocks and draft horses to pull the ploughs. Again, those requests were promptly denied, saying, "Use the convicts." Major Lord set about developing new industries, of course, and building construction to try and keep his convict population fully occupied. Hours of work were from 5 a.m. until 6 p.m. An hour for breakfast, 1.5 hours for dinner in the lunchtime. In winter, the prisoners went to work at 7:30 a.m. and continued until dusk. Work stopped at 1 o'clock on Saturdays to allow the convicts to wash their clothes, but no work was done on Sundays, of course, after church services. But in the meantime, a vast new timber resource had been discovered at Stewart's Harbour, which we now know as, of course, Port Arthur. Timber gangs were sent there and was found to make a very suitable convict settlement. By September 1832, all convicts on Maria Island were removed to either Port Arthur or Sarah Island. Some were given tickets of leave made free, basically. Soon after, the Maria Island was leased for agricultural purposes. By late 1833, it was decided to close also Sarah Island, In January 1834, the final 10 remaining convicts there hijacked a newly built brig, the Frederick, which they successfully sailed all the way to Chile, where they lived for several years. Eventually they were recaptured and brought back to Hobart Town. As I mentioned at the beginning, Port Arthur is the most well-known place of incarceration in Tasmania. I won't dwell on it too much, as you know all about it. But it began as at that small timber gathering station in 1830. And the settlement was soon seen as the ideal location to house secondary offending convicts because of its closeness to Hobart Town. Conditions were harsh, but under great supervision, the inmates worked tirelessly to construct the many beautiful buildings that are there, many still there today. Shipbuilding was introduced, coal mining, and lots of trades to keep the men occupied. A later approach, though, was to the construction of the separate prison system, introduced a different type of punishment, basically psychological punishment for these prisoners. The inmates were kept strictly alone and silent, but they were allocated tasks to keep them somewhat busy in their cells. The system was later seen as a failure, as many of the prisoners developed mental illnesses and had to be transferred to an adjoining asylum. At the end of transportation, the settlement continued to be used as a jail, asylum and ex-convict pauper establishment until it closed in April 1877. Across the bay in the distance was Point Puer, the small settlement where young transported boys were held from 1834 till 1848. It was the first purpose-built institution for the reformation of young male criminals in the British Empire. The boys ranged in age from 9 to late teenagers and sometimes into their 20s. The aim was to try and make responsible adult citizens out of these boys by the use of education, religious instruction and trade training. They were kept separated from all the male convicts as much as possible. The overall achievement of this establishment had a bit of a diverse result because many of the young mates did become honest and successful citizens pursuing their trades, whilst a number did commit serious offences as adults and was sent back to Port Arthur, of course, where they'd grown up. Other punishment methods were, of course, needed. Even some minor offences were punishable by the men being sent on labour to road gangs scattered around the settled parts of the island. These men mostly worked long hours, wearing leg irons or chains to render escape quite difficult. They were employed forming roads or repairing parts of roads under the direction of an officer and several overseers. The men were housed in simple, movable wooden stations. The buildings were old and in bad repair. There was limited storage and virtually primitive cooking facilities for the men. But when necessary, the buildings could be easily disassembled, loaded onto a wagon and moved to the next location. But the men were usually under a short sentence, thus the number on each gang was always fluctuating. Because of the isolation, the officers in charge frequently considered themselves independent of rules and regulations. As a result, management and control of these stations was quite inadequate and eventually shut down. And then there were the hulks. Prison hulks were ships that no longer were engaged in active trade as a ship, yet they could fulfil an important function to hold convicts when all the other establishments were overcrowded here in Hobart Town. The use of hulks in Britain, of course, was fundamental to the transportation of convicts to the colonies. Most of the convicts sent here would have spent some time aboard a hulk awaiting transportation. The first hulk in Hobart Town was originally a whaler called the Sophie. Or Sophia, sorry. It traded around the coast and was used to establish the Sarah Island penal colony in Macquarie Harbour, but it was brought by the government in 1822 and renamed the Duke of York. It held male convicts while it was moored in Sullivan's Cove, and later it was moored in Newtown Bay, where it remained beside the Newtown Probation Station until it was beached and sold, broken up in 1843. The next year, 1844, saw the arrival of the Anson in the Derwent. The Anson, the largest convict vessel to arrive in Hobart Town, brought 500 male prisoners and a number of soldiers. But it was an old ship, and it remained here until it was decided that it would be laid up as a hulk for the reception of the increasing number of female probation prisoners. Once out, the Anson was towed to Newtown Bay and anchored just off the probation station, where it could hold up to 500 women at any one time. It was in use as a prison hulk until 1850. Now, as I mentioned, female convicts were moved in 1828 to the Cascades Female Factory, which had been built originally as a distillery several years before. The buildings in South Hobart, they were isolated, which was looked on as beneficial to keep the female convicts away from the town, but the buildings were cold, damp and dark beneath the hills and, of course, being overshadowed by Mount Wellington. The whole establishment was ruled by a superintendent, a matron and, of course, several minor staff. The women themselves were divided into separate classes to avoid communication. It does sound rather harsh, but it did work. The first class consisted of newly arrived women and those who had shown good behaviour on their arrival. These women were assignable, and when appropriate employment was found, they were sent out to work. The second class consisted of those women who were guilty of minor offences or by improved conduct had been removed from the crime class. Now, the crime class women were repeat offenders or retransported women and those found guilty of serious crimes. Up there at Cascades, the first class women were employed in general duties such as cooking and overseeing the other women. The second class were mainly employed making and repairing linen, making clothes and similar tasks. The crime class women, though, were sent to the wash tub, laundering for all the other penal establishments, spinning wool and other menial tasks. Life at the female factory was difficult, with long, arduous hours. Every morning the floors were wet scrubbed, during the cold, damp winter months meant that those floors never dried. The women were punishable for minor offences, for neglect of work, for obscene or abuse language, insubordination and disrespectful conduct. The offences were all punishable by solitary confinement. And of course, there was a large number of children were kept there as well, and it had a huge impact. The death rate amongst children was absolutely horrible. After the close of transportation, some of the yards up there at South Hobart were needed as a jail to house female prisoners, but other buildings within the complex were utilised as invalid depots for both males and females, a boys' reformatory, a hospital for contagious diseases and an insane asylum. But the women were moved to Campbell Street in April 1877, the same week as the remaining male prisoners were brought by a government schooner from Port Arthur. Now, there were several other female factories used during the convict era. Georgetown was a settled area, becoming the northern administrative town in the early days. A female factory was established in 1822, and although the seat of government was moved to Launceston, the factory continued to be used until 1834. Seen on the left here, it was a small, cold, dismal establishment, basically a two-storey house in the centre of Georgetown. On arrival, the women were received by the matron. Her clerk then recorded the name, the date of arrival, and the day in which the inmate would be discharged. Any money or trinkets were handed over for safekeeping, but probably disappeared. After examination by a surgeon, the inmate was taken to a nearby room where she was bathed and dressed in cheap and coarse prison clothing, consisting of a petticoat, a cotton gown, an apron, and a jacket. Each week, the prisoner would receive clean linen consisting of 2 aprons, shifts, handkerchiefs, and stockings. Rules regarding the daily life at the factory included cleanliness, quietness, regularity, submission and industry. All punishments for disobedience of orders, neglect of work, profane, obscene or abusive language were carried out. And those conditions happened at all the female factories, of course. The women at Georgetown, they lived in small rooms and hammocks slung together. There was a Bible and a few books provided. Again, like the male convicts on Maria Island, they were mustered at 5:30 in the morning and at work by 6 o'clock. They received breakfast of a quarter pound of bread and a pint of gruel at 8 o'clock. Then prayers and back to labour until midday, when they were given half a pound of bread and a pint of soup thickened with vegetables. They laboured all afternoon until sunset, and at 7:30 they ate supper with another quarter pound of bread and a pint of soup before attending more prayers. The Launceston Female Factory, as I said, was built in 1834 under the same rules and regulations as at Georgetown. Much later, a male convict station at Ross was closed and converted to Females' House of Correction. It is better known today, well, it's also better known today as the Ross Female Factory. It enabled the hiring of women in the Midlands, but also had workshops, punishment blocks, solitary cells, a chapel, a hospital and a nursery. The Female Factory at Ross ran very successfully until it was closed in November 1854. The remaining women there were returned to Hobart. All the buildings, except for the superintendent's residence, were demolished and sold off for building materials in Ross. That's why Ross has such beautiful buildings there. Came from the Female Factory. The whole area around the Ross Female Factory became a sheep paddock for many years. Now, for more information regarding the female factories, there are these fascinating books containing many day-to-day real-life stories. They're published by the Female Convicts Research Group, and they concern the factories at Cascades, Georgetown, Launceston and Ross. Now, some of you, I know there were some books, are they all gone now? There were some books that were given out today, so yes, you were lucky if you received one of those. I had one already, so I didn't read one. Thanks, Sandra, anyway. But there are other places of confinement as well, lying in hospitals, asylums, but with limited time today, I'll have to shorten the talk. With the end of transportation to New South Wales, the penal settlement of Norfolk Island was handed over to Van Diemen's Land Control, and it was heavily utilised as an additional place of secondary punishment. In conjunction with Port Arthur, small government schooners ran a regular service between the settlements, delivering and returning convicts and supplies. The system of incarceration on Norfolk Island has filled countless books with stories of the harshment and treatment of the inmates. So I won't even bother going into the story of the island. But if you haven't been to the Norfolk Island, it's certainly worth a visit there. You need to spend at least a week to visit and absorb the unique penal establishments on the building. And there's lots of good museums and information there. However, in the late 1830s, with an increasing number of convicts arriving, the employment and opportunities for them to be assigned out to the free population began to diminish, and it was decided that a new system of control was needed. The probation system was introduced in 1839, along with no more sending of convicts to New South Wales. They all came to Tasmania. And it was a unique method of penal discipline. At the beginning, all newly arrived convicts were sentenced to a period of confinement and labour in gangs, usually between 12 and 18 months. And this was done at one of the more than 40 probation stations that were built around the island. The original assignment system had been a very long-standing effective system for treatment, punishment and reform of convicts, albeit regarded by some here and in the British government as white slavery, which wasn't a good term. While setting up the probation system, though, inquiries and reports were conducted on the buildings at Darlington, Sarah Island and the outlying penal stations such as this one at Impression Bay on Tasman Peninsula. Little used jails and lockups were modified. Many small confinement buildings were hurriedly erected in various areas where it was thought that'd be a good place to station some convicts. If the convict's behaviour and progress was satisfactory, then he could receive a ticket of leave very quickly and a probation pass, which enabled him to be available for paid employment by the free settlers. Continuing good conduct would lead to a conditional pardon and eventually a certificate of freedom. As I said, there were a number from between 40 and 45 probation stations, as you can see by this map. But the scheme itself, probation, was termed at the time a disastrous failure. Eventually the system was abandoned at the end of transportation in 1853. Funding the large number of these stations around the state, you had to have staff, officers, and there was poor planning and administration, placing such a large number of virtually free convicts into areas with little future employment, such as here on Maria Island, where they built this huge cell block for them and there was nothing for them to do, apart from put them in a cell block. So the whole system was shut down. Okay, I think it's possibly time we should start to examine the documents concerning incarceration of the men, women and children in establishments that I have described. These include convict records, jail records, court documents, as well as asylum and institution records. But deciphering a document can be rather exciting. To be able to determine the meaning of something that looks quite obscure or is illegible, or to transcribe details from a document with lots of abbreviations like convict records can be quite a fulfilling task, as some of you hopefully have tried. The end result can often give you a detailed insight into what happened and what was going on at that time with your ancestor or the person you're researching. If you had a free ancestor here, unless they left diaries, basically you don't know much about them. But a convict ancestor, there's lots of things. That's why I have to say here, this incredible library and archive office in which we're situated, and the work that's being done and is continuing being done, digitising an astounding amount of records concerning estate and family history, is truly worthy of its UNESCO Memory of the World International Register status. Well done, library. Okay. Let's begin with the Library Tasmania website. You all possibly know it, but still we'll talk about it. Click on Family History, then on the Tasmania Names Index, which now contains a staggering 1.3 million names on this Tasmanian Family Index. Type in a name and you may well come up with an incredible number of records: births, deaths, marriages, arrivals, departures, convict and prison records, court documents, inquests and wills, and the list goes on and on and on. So let's concentrate on incarceration at the moment. Many of you possibly discovered that you have a convict prison ancestor. And as I said, the records are online. You can instantly download the records and save them to your computer, which is great, but then trying to understand what was written can be a bit daunting. On arrival, the convicts were interviewed before disembarking from their ships. Their basic crime and sentence, which called assignment details, which came out with them, was then recorded with their personal descriptions in large journals by convict writers and officials that went out to the ship. All that information was then copied to a parchment document, sometimes referred to as a police record. This parchment document, police record document, was sent with the convicts as he or she travelled around the island. So details of local misdemeanours, offences and sentences were recorded on that document. I mean, in those days there was no mobile phones or telexes or anything like that. So everything was recorded on his police record. On the convict's return, his police record would be sent back to the convict department with the new details transferred into the convict record books as we know them today. Unfortunately, I have to say this, only a few original parchment records survive today. Tens of thousands were deliberately destroyed in 1963 by fire. However, back in the 19th century, these convict writers soon began using abbreviations and acronyms to save space and time. The writers understood them all, much the same today as people use texting on their mobile phones. But fortunately, we have today a fantastic group of dedicated volunteers. They work virtually every day in transcribing and creating data from these convict records. Fairness and survivors have been working exceptionally hard to transcribe convict records, especially with the male convict records, and offer a great research facility. Similarly, the Female Convict Research Group have done an amazing job in transcribing the female convict records. You can go to their website, join up and log on to their database. You'll be amazed at the way every detail of the convicts are accessible and cross-indexed, with volunteer researchers from overseas adding details from records in the UK. Now, for help with transcribing, what is probably the most comprehensive publication is Transcribing Tasmanian Convict Records, written by Susan Hood. And you'll see there is a copy of it down the back there, so there are copies in the library here. It was published by the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority some time back. But Sue clearly examines just how to systematically transcribe the convict records, which can at first appear quite overwhelming. Multiple examples of different records are plainly illustrated, along with a comprehensive abbreviation and commonly used term index. And of course, there is the Tasmanian Family History Society, who have accomplished volunteers eager to assist you with your research. Right, well, let's talk about what I can show you today. We'll start with the male convicts. Male convict records, the early ones were listed as Con 31. They are from the assignment period, which operated right up until 1840. I'll be using samples from some of my own research. That's people of whom I've worked and done a little bit of research myself. George Bailey, this is his Con 31 record. Normally the books are quite large, so there were normally 4 records on each page, but I've cropped the others out. But I'm not here today, certainly not here today, to delve into individual case histories, but merely to see how they were written up and compiled with other records. But I will talk a little bit about George. As you can see, in the early days, the book was turned on its side at the beginning, and using red ink, early details were written, usually about why the convict was transported, with some family details. So you can see later on, as the convict committed local offences or misdemeanours, those were then written in black ink across, up and down the page, which blotted out a lot of that red ink details. But the details of the red ink contain when the convict appeared in local Supreme Court, back in England, and it is quite handy to be able to look at it. Sometimes you can, and I have gone over this in red with George, but he was transported for burglary. The next line down stated his jail report in England, and it was supposedly a bad character, but it does add later orderly, which is interesting. His Hulk report, so he did spend time in a Hulk, again orderly for that. He was asked, what was your crime, but he didn't say. He did make a mention that his mother lived at Kingswood, and then the next line he said his parents were at Bristol, which is where Kingswood was. And then the last line, he was married to a widow. So yes, that's all we know about him, yes. Well, let's go back to his original record. Right at the top, you'll see the page number, which beneath that it says TL 2.7.40, which means he received his ticket of leave the first time on the 2nd of July 1840. On the left, what is commonly called his police number, 457, and this numbering system changed, of course, over time. Sometimes it was given to convicts on the ship or on their arrival, and later, basically on their arrival, it was a numerical running order for every convict that arrived. Under his name is recorded that he was transported on the Lord Hungerford, with number 2 signifying it was the second voyage of the ship bearing convicts. He was tried in Gloucester on the 4th of April 1821, and he did receive a life sentence. Now, as you read down through there, not that you can probably read it from this distance, but the date of the local offence or his charge where he received local offences, that's the date is always underlined. Then the status, what he was doing, who he worked for, he had ticket of leave or whatever, that's next. And sometimes it was where he was working, of course. Then the crime of misdemeanour, or crime or misdemeanour, that's the next thing. Then quite often again separated by a comma and sometimes not, the sentence he received. And following in brackets are the initials of the police magistrate or magistrates who heard the offence gave the sentence. Now, if you're interested also to want to know more about police magistrates, you need to return to the brilliant Female Convict Research website. Under the convict system page, you'll find a comprehensive list of magistrates. I think it's a PDF, which it's great to download. And if you're trying to find out who sentenced your ancestor, you could look that up. Now, back to George again. Usually, you probably noticed, right down the bottom of the page, it says executed. But nowhere does it mention the crime for which he was executed. But right next to that, there's small lettering, which you might see. It says SV, which stands for second volume, N2, which is number 2, and also a page number, which is right in the corner. But this is a reference to Book 2, which is now listed as Con 32. A continuation of the records where George Con 31 page was full. Here on page 36, George's later offences are detailed, but still not his major crime. So, just to satisfy us today, why was George executed? And it's part of the story. To find out that, we have to go to Supreme Court records, and you go to SC 32, which you'll find listed on the names index, usually in the convict. And it's detailed minutes of proceedings in criminal cases, Supreme Court cases, and referred to the Tasmanian Names Index as the prosecution project. Brilliant work done over the past few years, going through every page of SC 32s. So on the 20th of December 1841, James Wilkinson was charged with the murder of Thomas Lord, and George Bailey was an accessory there too. In other words, George helped James Williamson to murder Thomas Lord. Both men pleaded not guilty, but by the jury of 12 men, they were both found guilty. Oh, I missed that one. Yes, okay. What happened? Did you see George on there or not? Oh, he was on there. I didn't realise. I can't see it. Okay. So yeah, that was George as in the court. Came off Trove, of course, so you know all about Trove. 7 days later, both men appeared in court and were sentenced to be hanged, and afterwards their bodies dissected, which was a further punishment for if you murdered someone. But those SC32 records do contain an amazing amount of detail. Now, moving on, later on they changed the layout of the Con 31 records, usually into the 1830s. They only had 3 convicts listed per page, which gave you more room to write, so you didn't have to go into more of Con 32s. But the details were similar, except that the convicts' transportations were now written in red ink at the top rather than turned on the side of the page. It made it much easier to read. Dates and offences and sentences and all those details much the same. But the writing can be just as confusing depending on who wrote it at the time. There were other records, of course. Con 18 was description records, giving you an idea of just what Thomas James looked like when he came out, which was recorded locally. Notice a large amount at the bottom of details there is his tattoos. Now, if you want to know more about tattoos on convicts, you can't go past Simon Barnard's brilliant book, but it's amazingly drawing details, there is a copy here in the library, of course, probably several copies. Appropriation. Con 27 is a well-written list of where to and to whom the individual convicts were first assigned or appropriated after arrival, depending on their skill or trade. It could be a settler, a government department, or even a road gang. But yes, the next step was on to after 1839, and the records then came under a new system under the probation era, and they were called Con 33, or they're listed as Con 33 in this magnificent library we're in. They contain all the necessary information which was previously spread over several pages in various books. I've chosen Alan Williamson because of his multiple reoffending and the fact that his police record still exists, one of a couple of dozen. Alan was the second last of the 74,000 convicts sent to Van Diemen's Land here, still basically incarcerated and funded under the British imperial system. He died in Hobart Jail, again still in jail, 1893, after just on nearly 60 years in jail. There was another convict, Mark Jeffrey, who did outlive him as one of the last convicts still under the system. But Alan's Con 33 record does not specify in which ship he arrived, but as you can see, all the other information has decent headings: when and where he was tried, his sentence, his crime, and why he was transported, this ship surgeon report. Oh, and this, we've got, things skipped ahead, sorry. I didn't realise that was Alan's photo. I've been talking about his record. Just have a look at it. Yes, probably. Did you see that? Oh, you did see that. Okay. I really need to be able to see this myself. I can do it. Okay. Well, yeah, later on, there's Alan. He was incarcerated at Campbell Street Jail, as I said, until he died in 1893. And his photo was taken, and multiple copies of prints were then attached to each of his various records, and especially his original Parchment record, which was still being used at the time to identify him. So they did an amazing job when they started to photograph the prisoners in jail, because those photos were then attached, able to go back through lots of the records. We'll come to more of that. But because of Alan's reoffending, he does appear on page 21 of a later jail record book in the system GD 63. You can see the same layout as used for as Con 33, but it does have a few handwritten alterations. Now, enough talk about male convict records, so here's some samples of female convict records, hopefully. Their layout and abbreviation were the same and identical with the Con 30 male convict records. So they are still quite difficult to read. One thing that I will point out here on Sarah's record is something that doesn't appear on men's records. That says UX, which stands for Uxor, meaning wife. So once Sarah married, some of her records were detailed and things listed under her married name rather than her original name. It's something to have to watch. You see that UXOR, usually a big U, XOR, it means that the convict actually married. If it doesn't say that already on the record, sometimes they actually list it on the record that the female convict did marry. It was interesting that it looked like her husband had her locked up for misconduct, but we won't go there. But the female convict records use the same layout as the male convict records. The later Con 41 records were the same as the male Con 33 records. Similarly, the description records for the females were exactly the same as the male Con 19, or Con 18 records, but they used the same forms and each time they had to cross out whiskers. That's about all they had to do.
Some aren't crossed
well, some aren't crossed out. Okay, right. Well, maybe. Well, I said I wasn't going to go there because that was a bit personal. I thought some of them may have whiskers, which they could have done. Oh. Okay. Now, I have to say it again. The Archives online database is without doubt a remarkable resource which is continually being refined and updated. However, there are above us in the part of the building here and at Berriedale innumerable shelves containing side-by-side kilometres of records and files detailing the daily lives, happenings and activities of the men and women incarcerated during those 19th and 20th centuries. So let's start with the jail department, which dealt with the management and control of jails and prisons and their safe custody, punishment and training of prisoners contained therein. There are upwards of 150 various categories in the series dating from 1823 to 1960s, so I can't cover them all. Let's start with GD21. It's the daily journal of the deputy jailer, beginning with one volume from Murray Street Jail in 1834. It contains fascinating stories of what happened in the jail, Murray Street Jail in those early days. But there are another 21 volumes from Campbell Street Jail right through to 1955, and amazing information in those books. Now, the gatekeeper also kept a journal, and that's called GD29. It's a lot less informative of activities inside the jail, and also Risdon Prison, some of them goes into, but there are 43 surviving volumes recording the names and the arrival and departure time of all people, including prisoners and deliveries, coming through the jail gates between 1892 and 1972. It's amazing if you want to find out who visited someone at the time. E9, another interesting set of 3 overlapping volumes, that details a record of service of the 400 jail officials between 1890 and 1960. Excellent if you have an ancestor, because it tells you when they were first appointed, how much they were paid, what the jobs they did at the jail, and when they retired. Amazing stuff. There are ration books in 9 volumes from GD 56, which give a daily record of everyone fed in the jails, including men, women and staff between 1880 and 1947, albeit unfortunately the details of the variety of the particular rations are not specified, but they may be in another book somewhere, we've never found them. But those preceding volumes I've just talked about have not been digitised as yet, and thus are not online. But the individual volumes can be viewed in person here in the history room, down the passageway there, by an order online via the library's website. Some of the most useful records are online. And these are the prison record books GD 63, which range from 1892 through to 1962 in 20 volumes, albeit book 2 disappeared and makes indexing a little bit complicated. But 8 of the volumes are now online. Unfortunately, many of the volumes were partially damaged in 1967 by a deliberately lit fire, which destroyed several storerooms at Risdon Prison where they were. But stored here, again upstairs in the archives, are 99 archive boxes 99 boxes containing individual prison records and court files under the title GD 61. It's currently boxes are currently being indexed. Thus far, 49 boxes with a total of over 3,000 prisoners' files have been scanned and indexed. The prisoners' names should eventually be added to the Tasmanian Names Index when I get it finished. GD 67. Two of the surviving 9 volumes of physical descriptions of prisoners received into jail from the 1880s until the early 1890s have been digitised and are online at GD 67. The other 7 volumes are available on microfilm in the microfilm room out here. GD 128. There are also 3 volumes partially assembled from individual files of prisoners photographed between 1895 and 1902, which are now online at GD 28. Fascinating being able to see photos, original photos of those prisoners. Brilliant. But I could go on and on, of course, but there are books detailing who visited the prisoners, how they were employed, just where they were housed in the jail, their individual cells, their medical treatment, even babies born in the jail, and registers of prisoners who died while under sentence. I had planned to discuss some of the Supreme Court records which contain masses of information. There are over 300 categories in the archives detailing some amazing filled records and books. And here are just a few important ones which are available. I'll leave it on there for a couple of minutes if people want to. I've tried to make it as big as possible, but we couldn't fit them all in. But SC32, so I'll read about SC32, minutes of proceedings of the criminal cases. SC41, registers of prisoners tried. SC45, register of prisoners discharged by proclamation. SC79, indictments. SC237, return of jails, executions and estimates. SC488, sheriff's record proceedings in criminal court cases. And SC511, judges' copies of papers in criminal cases. As I said, there are over 300 categories. That's only half a dozen, 7 of them. Yes, I certainly am running out of time. There are numerous records available regarding incarceration at Newtown establishment, which is originally known as the King's Asylum for Children, and later, of course, it was known as the Queen's Orphan Schools. Again, this is a website from the Friends of the Orphan Schools, and it offers a brilliant search facility to discover information regarding orphans, children and their parents confined at Newtown. Later, those buildings at Newtown were utilised as a boys' training school and reformatory, then as charitable institutions for men and women, providing care for the aged, including paupers and those with physical difficulties and suffering from consumption. Now, as for records, an alphabetical admission register for the Newtown Infirmary from 1914 to 1952 is online at HSD 274 from the Tasmanian Archives. An online alphabetical index of deceased and discharged patients' files can also be accessed at HSD 186 from the Archives website. These detailed patient files, numbering in their thousands of those from the institutions, are available here, can be inspected here at the history room. They're not online, of course. Incarceration at the Willow Court Asylum at New Norfolk for the mentally ill dated back to 1827 and continued with extensive additional buildings into the middle of the 20th century. Again, many of the later records and casebooks have survived from the era of the Mental Diseases Hospital. There are patient files and casebooks detailing the patient's names, ages, dates of admission, names and address of relatives, and naturally prison behaviour and treatment of people as well. That's at HSD 284. And at AB 365, you can make inquiries for access for those amazingly detailed records, which you have to best direct it out here to the extremely helpful and knowledgeable people out here in archives, rather than, they can't be put online, of course. Yeah, we're going well for time, but I do have here on display some of my own publications containing a few more records and documents which you may find interesting to have a look at, but please don't remove any of them because they're my only copies. And perhaps it's time for me to conclude. So, and I will answer any questions, or I'll try to answer questions if I can. So thank you.